Hey, I think we're on. I want to welcome and thank you for joining us today for a discussion about the parallels between the incarceration during World War II and today. And we have three experts here who are working very hard trying to prevent this history from repeating itself, our very own history. Dr. Karen Korematsu, who you see with the red glasses, is the daughter of the late Fred Korematsu, who's famous, of course, for resisting the internment. And she is the founding executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. Lorraine Banai, who has the red scar, is the director of the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality at Seattle University School of Law. And she was also a member of the Coram Nobis legal team that successfully challenged Fred Korematsu's conviction during World War II. Jon Osaki, who you know because he's the only guy here, is the director and the producer of Alternative Facts. And if you haven't seen it, you really need to. This film about the lies of Executive Order 9066. He is also the executive director of the Japanese Community Youth Council in San Francisco. So welcome to all of our panelists, and we will be taking questions from all of you out there and wherever you are in your front rooms. If you do have a question, just go to YouTube and fire away, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I want to jump right into this now, though. Each of our panelists has some opening thoughts, and Lori, let's start with you because you're right up there.
Okay, thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. We were kind of asked to just say something really briefly about what we really wanted to make sure we talk about today. And I think that one of the most important things to me is that Japanese Americans have a really important voice today in the current national conversation about race and institutional racism. Our community knows about institutional racism and about the costs of ignorance and fear and prejudice because of its history of discrimination against Japanese Americans culminating in its incarceration. In addition, I think what's really important is that we know what happens when the legal system fails, and we need to understand that and speak out about our own experience. During World War II, elected officials on every level of government called for the incarceration of Japanese Americans based on prejudice, not on facts, not on concepts of justice. The country sacrificed civil liberties in the name of national security, and the court stood aside and let this all happen and gave the government a rubber stamp. So I think that we've seen this pattern recur over and over again in history when minority communities are targeted because of fear, and our legal system fails to protect them. So I really hope that we delve into that conversation today.
We will do that. And let's skip down to Karen. Karen, what are your thoughts today as we head into this discussion?
Well, I wanted to share with you about the Fred T. Korematsu Institute because our mission is educating to advance racial equity, social justice, and human rights for all. So all the work that we're doing is obviously so relevant today. My father gave me the charge before he passed away to carry on with education. And what I have said is that prejudice is ignorance, and our most powerful tool is education. So in 2009, I established the Fred T. Korematsu Institute after my father had passed away. And actually, it was thanks to Assembly member then, Warren Fuatani, who wanted to establish Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution for the state. And it's recognized on my father's birthday of January 30th. Governor Schwarzenegger signed the legislative bill in 2010, and we had our first launch and celebration on January 30th, 2011. And the point, as I mentioned in the entire name, is about our civil liberties and the Constitution. And today, it's at risk. Our democracy is at risk, and that's why we're having these conversations to motivate everyone to vote, to fill out the census, and talk about the dangers of the anti-Asian rhetoric, the harassment, the violence, anti-Black, anti-trans, LGBTQ, Muslim. I mean, it just goes on and on because unfortunately the history in this country is we marginalize those other ethnicities. And now we need to stop that. We need to work together to connect the dots and to be sure that we are fighting for our democracy together, because that's how we make a difference and to work across communities. So what we're talking about today, especially from Jon's film, and the results of my father's Supreme Court case in 1944 was, to the prejudice, to uphold the prejudice and the fear that Lori was speaking about, but also because in 1983, when his conviction was overturned, the results of that was governmental misconduct. And that's what we're talking about today.
You know what, Karen? We'll get into some of those things as we get into this discussion. Let's hear from Jon for a second, and then we'll come back to that. But Jon, why don't you let us know what's on your mind today as we begin this discussion?
Sure. Thanks, Wendy. And just wanted to say I'm very pleased to be here, pleased to have everybody joining us here today. And the thing that on my mind is that, before the pandemic, myself, actually Karen, Lori, Don Tamaki, several others were running around the country having these conversations about the parallels between the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans and the parallels to today. And I think it's important to say from the very beginning that nobody is suggesting that what happened to Japanese Americans is identical to the oppression of groups today. But I do think what we are saying is that the root causes that led to the incarceration of our entire community, those causes are similar to what is taking place today. And I think that's going to be what we focus our conversation on. And I just wanted to say that, I'm not a trained or experienced filmmaker, but I felt compelled to make my film Alternative Facts because I realized during the last presidential election that we had reached the point in this country where our unjust incarceration as a community was being weaponized. It was being used to justify the oppression of other groups. And that was just not acceptable to me. I decided that I had to do something about it. And this film was me doing something about it. And I want to encourage everybody who is part of this program today to also think about what they can do about it to ensure that our experience is not manipulated to justify the oppression of other groups, and that we really think about, as Lori said, our role as a community that has experienced one of the greatest civil liberties violations in the history of this country.
So, Jon, let me pick up on something that you just mentioned and open up right now this next question for all of our panelists, which is, Karen, you mentioned connecting the dots. Let's get right to that question. Jon, you mentioned in connecting the dots that you did not want to see our experience as Japanese Americans who are children of the internment. You didn't want to see it weaponized. Can you be more specific about that?
Absolutely. I think that some of you may recall that in 2016, public officials and political pundits started to come forward and suggest that the incarceration of our community was not only justified, but it served as precedent for oppression, that oppressive policies that should be put in place against, at that time, they were talking about Syrian refugees. And I think, this narrative of fear that Lori and Karen referred to is really one of the clearest parallels to what's going on today. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about those parallels, and that, if you saw my film, you know that, the incarceration of our community was really about politics, right? It was really about a political agenda, because every intelligence agency at the time, the FBI, the Federal Communications Commission, the Office of Naval Intelligence, unanimously concluded that Japanese Americans were not a threat to national security. And those findings were ignored. And they were ignored because they did not fit the political narrative of exclusionists at the time. They did not fit the political narrative of farmers who wanted the land, of Japanese farmers. And so ultimately what happened is those interest groups got to our politicians. And those politicians who were trying to placate their political bases got to the military. And that's really what the incarceration of our entire community was about. It was really about this political agenda. And I think that, what's very clear right now is that if the intelligence agencies of today, if their findings do not fit within the political narrative of our current administration, they get ignored. And leaders of intelligence agencies who do not fit into the narrative of our current presidential administration, if they do not go along with the political narrative, they get removed. And so I think that, right there, those are some of the, really, frankly, frightening parallels to what happened in 1942, what's happening today. And I think that this whole process of demonizing entire groups of people, making the public afraid of them, makes it possible to dehumanize them, makes it possible for us to enact policies that oppress them. And I think what's really taking place today that is so similar to what happened to our community is it's really a playbook. It's really a playbook of making people afraid of certain groups. And unfortunately, one of the really serious flaws in this country is that it was in 1942 and is still the case today, where it's okay to treat certain groups differently than others. And I think that's really at the root of a lot of what we are experiencing today. And so I just think it's really important to point out to this audience, to our community, and to others that, what was really behind the incarceration of our community, that hasn't gone away. Things like racism, politics, those types of issues are still very much at play today. And unfortunately, many are running the exact same playbook that took place in 1942.
Karen, you want to jump on that and talk about, you have also been traveling the country and speaking to this issue and these parallels that you have seen. Tell us what you are seeing that is happening today that is very parallel to what happened in 1941, 1942.
Well, not only today, but it's been even when my father was still living. The day after, a few days after 9/11, 2001, the government cited my father's Supreme Court case as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in American concentration camps. So he's the first one that one of the first ones to speak up and said, no, he reminded the government of his case and the incarceration. And that's why learning this history is so important, I might add, because we have to understand our history and know it, because it is repeated. We need to refer back to it, and because it seems like the government has a very short memory. And they always continue to make these mistakes. So, especially, I mean, the names have maybe changed, but the issues are still the same. The outright, racism and xenophobia is still what's so prevalent and alarming. I know we're going to talk about, I think, about Trump versus Hawaii as an example of the Muslim travel ban, right? So this is kind of what happens along the way when there's no checks and balances. And so what people are crying out for is that kind of support, right? They've been crying out for that kind of support in addressing these types of racist issues.
With Muslims a lot, if I remember correctly, on all of this. What are you hearing from that, from Muslims that you work with? Karen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wendy, I didn't hear you. You cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know that you have worked with the Muslim community or people in the Muslim community around this whole issue. What have you heard from them generally that reverberates in you?
What I've heard from them is that they're afraid. And when they start sharing with me that their children are afraid to go to school because they're being bullied. And, especially during this time of ICE, everyone was afraid that if they went to school, they would be picked up, and then the children, and then they would never see their parents again. Or the parents would be picked up and the children would never see them again. I mean, it was kind of those different scenarios. So that was the biggest thing was the fear, and not knowing what to do. I mean, fortunately, I will have to say that, in 1942, at the time of the Executive Order 9066, there were not the organizations around to speak up. And make the government accountable, to say, no, you cannot incarcerate a whole group of people just because they look like the enemy. At least now we have the different organizations across this country that are working together to help Muslims to fight those kinds of civil rights issues. And so that's what I'm seeing now, that there's more. Even out of the Korematsu Center in Seattle, there's been a lot of work. So at least now that's what's happening.
Well, speaking of Seattle, let's move to Lori Banai, who works at Seattle U. And actually, Lori, a lot of people who are tuning in right now may not know a lot about Coram Nobis. Maybe you can give us a little bit of background there and then tie it to what you see today.
Sure. Let me give a little bit of background on the World War II cases, and then I want to talk about the World War II Japanese American incarceration cases, and then their later reopening and the Coram Nobis cases as a backdrop to the continuing relevance today. I really appreciate Jon's earlier comments about understanding the history. of dehumanization of Japanese Americans, that one cannot understand the Japanese American incarceration or many of current events today without understanding that they're rooted in a long history of animosity and dehumanization of communities of color and immigrant communities. Japanese Americans, again, have a unique place to speak from because we share that history with so many current communities. Dehumanizing laws, exclusionary laws that prevented Japanese Americans from intermarrying, from owning land, from citizenship, all of these providing a backdrop to the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the country turning on the Japanese American community, as you all know. Because of this fear and this hysteria, the public called for the removal of Japanese Americans. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which allowed military authorities to take any actions that they wished against anyone they wanted to take them against. And pursuant to that authority, these orders got issued. First for a curfew against Japanese Americans, then an order removing them, ordering them to leave the West Coast that ultimately resulted in their incarceration.
So this audience probably is aware of a lot of that history, but let's jump forward to your lawsuit.
Sure. So basically what happened, as Karen said, her father and two other men, Minyasu and Gordon Hibayashi, were arrested and convicted for violating these orders and convicted. The court said that there was military necessity for the orders, that the government had cause to do this. Horrible Supreme Court validation of this egregious wrong. Fast forward 40 years later, evidence was discovered by historian Peter Irons, Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig, that revealed what's explained in Jon's film, that the government lied to the Supreme Court, that there was, as Jon said, the government's own reports, intelligence reports said that there was no basis for incarcerating Japanese Americans, that DeWitt had written his original report that said that there was no basis, that there was not lack of time. Why I decided to remove the Japanese Americans is because no matter how much time you have, you can't tell a loyal Japanese from a disloyal one. Based on this evidence, legal teams were formed in Seattle and led by Catherine Banai and Rod Kawakami. Peggy Nagai led the Oregon team, Dale Minami led the San Francisco team, and we reopened the cases of the three men in the quorum nobis cases. Quorum nobis means error before us, so it seeks to correct an error that occurred before the court. So really, why does all this matter? What really matters is the danger that courts now will defer, and they do defer and say, look, if the government says this is for national security, we have no role. We're not going to seek and figure out if the government's telling the truth and what the true reasons are. And this is the continuing threat today because it creates fertile ground for government misconduct, for government to manipulate the record, for government to hide its true reasons for doing what it's doing. And we'll return to this some more when we talk about Trump versus Hawaii.
Well, let me just open up to all of you as we talk about these parallels today. Jon, you alluded to in this particular administration, we're seeing perhaps even more parallels than we have in prior years. You mentioned that. I'm wondering if you can get into a few more specifics.
Well, I think the most obvious ones is when the travel ban was proposed during, shortly after the presidential election, there was no evidence to substantiate it. Zero. Just as there was no evidence to substantiate the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And really the travel ban was really just the fulfillment of a campaign promise. It was just pure politics. It had nothing to do with what was actually going to keep our country safe. And I think that is one of the most glaring examples. I think that unfortunately today, we continue to have children separated from their families, locked in cages because of a political narrative around immigrants, and that they are murderers and rapists, and just there's this whole narrative around how they're bad for the country. And I'm not suggesting that our immigration system is perfect and doesn't need reform. I absolutely agree with that. But locking up families, separating children as a deterrent from people entering this country. I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves what our values are as a country and what we stand for. Just as when in 1942, when our entire community was locked up, I am sure that there were a lot of good people who knew it was wrong. But unfortunately, at that time, they stayed silent. And I think part of the discussion today is about our role as a community, having experienced these things, and whether or not we're going to be complicit with things taking place today. Whether, given the oppression that our community has experienced, what are we prepared to do to ensure that this does not continue to happen? Because when we talk about not wanting it to be repeated, the truth is it is being repeated right before our very eyes at this very moment.
Okay, specifics. And I open that to all of you. You say you see it being repeated now. How about, well, actually, before we get to that, to bring it home to our experience, the experience of Asian Americans, can we roll the video right now that's produced by Stop Repeating History? And I think it will bring us very much to personally how this is affecting our families, our friends within the Asian American community. Let's roll that video and then let's come back. And Jon, we're going to pick up on this. Don't worry, I won't lose that train of thought.
This pandemic
started
came out
in
of
China.
China.
It did come from China.
We're seeing a disturbing rise in hate-filled attacks.
China.
There has been an uptick in hate crimes against the Asian community.
Wearing a face mask was attacked in the New York subway station by a man claiming she was sick.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Why do you keep using this? A lot of
it comes from China.
racist.
The racism has also surfaced in classrooms.
This was the first time that I've ever felt I was being treated differently for being Asian.
The Chinese exclusion.
Come from China.
If you're from China, I need to know.
Internment camps ordered by President
Probation for killing a Chinese man.
People go out of their way to antagonize people that look different.
Okay, just so folks know that video was produced by StopRepeatingHistory.org, which check out their webpage sometime. But let me ask all the panelists and just open it up to all of you, your reactions to that video and what you're seeing today.
Well, so I'll pick it up since you asked me about specifics. I think that it's a critical reminder that although our community has not been the one scapegoated and targeted for a long, long time, it can happen at any moment. It can the animosity of this country can so easily be turned against us once again. And I think that is something we always have to be mindful of, that our education and our economic success is not going to protect us. And that, really the incarceration of Japanese Americans is really a story about being the unwanted immigrant in this country. It's a story about being the unwanted minority. And I think we are seeing that those exact issues being played out against Muslims, against African Americans right now, against migrants. It really is the exact same type of animosity, targeting, and scapegoating that our community experienced.
particular case, with regards to this video, it's happening to Asians.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious how Lori and Dr. Korematsu, if we can pull you in and just see your reaction to that video and what you're seeing in the work you do.
I think, echoing what Jon just said, I think first of all, on a personal level, certainly a very visceral reaction that they're talking about me. They're talking about me, go back to my country. Me, I don't belong here. And we go about our day to day, I think, and maybe don't even think a whole lot about how people look at us. And something like this happens and you realize that that's the first thing people see, is that you're Asian and you don't belong here. But I think reflecting also on what Jon said, it's really about changing the culture. I can talk about law. I'll talk some more about law. But really, in order to change things in this country, what Black Lives Matter is asking us all to do is to remember we have a culture that's been exclusionary against immigrants and communities of color since its inception. And unfortunately, it persists today. And that's what that video says. Just under the surface, just slightly under the surface, remains an animosity that casts immigrants and communities of color as different and dangerous and not belonging. And so I think that what that says to me is that even if you feel safe and even if you feel like you, quote, made it or you're okay, sometimes under the surface, sometimes not under the surface, as the video says, people are looking at you in a way that you don't belong. And we need to change the culture. We can't just change laws.
Karen, you want to jump in there?
And that's not going to come easy. There is no quick fix. We have a generation that sometimes gets a little impatient, but we have to all recognize it, for what it is, and to try to make that change. So it's not only recognizing those outright, racist kind of attacks. Even when I've been speaking over the years, people would say, oh, well, something like the Japanese American incarceration won't happen again. And I'm saying, you are fooling yourselves if you think that, because we're always on the edge. As Jon said, we can change the names and the faces, but the issues are still the same. The dehumanizing of different ethnicities. And so what I want to bring into this is that now we can all collectively do that. Because on a day-to-day basis, there's harassment, and there's an organization called Hollaback where you can go to them. They do bystander harassment training, and we can speak up. This is what my father said: to speak up when you see something wrong. Before, we've always been in our little different worlds, and keep to our own communities. We can't do that anymore. We need to work across communities. We need to uphold these outright racist attacks. And as Lori said, that's why Black Lives Matter is important. I think COVID also has really brought that to reality, because people are just so frustrated in general. But at least it's good that this generation, Gen X and millennials, are out there protesting, because that's what we need to do.
Let me give both Jon and Lori had some things they wanted to say as well. Go ahead and jump in, you guys.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, and I think that, to me, one of the important parallels is that I think as a country, we have to get back to demanding accountability from our government. And, unfortunately, in 1942, it was very convenient to blame Japanese Americans for the attack by, Imperial Japan. Just as today, it is very convenient to blame Asians for the COVID-19 pandemic. It's convenient to blame migrants and others for, crime and Muslims, for terrorists. It's very easy to blame people for what's wrong with this country. And I think as a nation, we have to start demanding accountability of our leaders. It is not acceptable to continue to just blame people for what's wrong. What I am, and I hope others are prepared to do, is demand that they come up with solutions, that they talk about how to improve things, and not just point the finger, because that does lead to the targeting that you see that's going on right now, today, that you saw in that video.
But Jon, one quick, well, not so quick perhaps, but a follow-up to that is many people have been trying to hold, I mean, let's be specific here, the president accountable for some of the statements he's made about Muslims, he's made about immigrants at the border, and it hasn't been too successful. So I know we have an election coming up in November, but just shy of that, have you found any successful way to hold people accountable during this specific time in history, during our time right now?
Well, I'll just speak quickly because I want to let Lori go. But I think that we have to continue to appeal to our own representatives, and they're the ones who have to keep the heat on. They have to put their feet to the fire and continue to speak out on our behalf. And that's really our most effective way to continue to demand accountability. And as you mentioned, in just a few months, we have probably the most consequential election that has ever taken place in my lifetime. And I think we have to think seriously about how important it is and how critical it is to ensure that we all participate.
Yeah, we'll be getting more to specifics, or I'd like to get more specific about what people can do. But Lori, jump in.
Okay, I totally agree about holding our elected officials accountable. We have the power of the vote that elects, that affects our legislature and our courts. But one of the things I wanted to do was to return to, Wendy, your question about specifics. We need to stop repeating history. What does that actually mean? Like, what do we need to stop if people aren't sure about it? We've talked a lot about what the parallels are. And I guess what I want to say is, when people say we want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else again, a lot of people think we don't want an incarceration of 120,000 people based on race. That's not really just what we're saying. We certainly don't want that. But we're talking about something much broader, and I think people have to be able to see these issues much more broadly. That is, any targeting of any individual or any group based on their membership in a larger group, whether it's one person or 10 people, is wrong. So just solely based on membership, a certain religion or a certain race is wrong. In addition, for example, the incarceration of families and children and the separation of families, that Japanese Americans understand that. Another example, the government policy informed by racism and fear. So I guess and the failure of the courts to act. So I guess what I want to make clear is that when we say we don't want this to ever happen again, we're not really just talking about exactly what happened during World War II. And in fact, we can talk some more about Trump versus Hawaii if you'd like, but one of the things that the court said in Trump versus Hawaii is the Muslim ban isn't anything like what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. This is an immigration issue. Japanese Americans were in the US. It's different because it's not like a racist order during World War II. This is about immigration and whether they're threatening terrorist attacks. But that's the same. Both orders were informed by racist, group-based membership, accusing people of being terrorists just because of their religion. So I guess I just wanted to make that clear, that we need to have our antenna up for the repeating of many different patterns that led to the wartime incarceration.
So I want to make sure that
I'd like to add just one thing that Jon said, talked about accountability. Also, it's very basic, but respect. We need to teach respect, because obviously it's not just something you're born with. we're, and in fact, the rest of the world has lost a lot of respect for us. And this starts even in the elementary school level. So having respect for each other, to agree to disagree, but to try to work forward together. But it's also the disrespectful comments that are coming out of elected officials that is also needs to be challenged.
Speaking to that, actually, we're getting a question here from Ken Mochizuki. I'm assuming this is Ken Mochizuki, the author, actor, and filmmaker. And he asks, what constitutional protections are there for immigrants? What is going on at the southern border a violation of the Constitution? Laura, you want to take that?
So I will tell you, I'm not a constitutional law scholar, nor am I an immigration law scholar. So I can't give you a definitive legal answer, but I will say that the whole area, this really calls in the whole area of immigration law, and immigrants are treated differently, and they're believed to have different lesser rights. That said, there are some minimum due process. There's a whole history of case law dealing with, well, can you base immigration decisions based on racism and things like that? So I'll say, as far as the legal aspect goes, I don't have a definitive answer. I'll say it's not terribly clear. Although, of course, there's vast power. The federal government has a wide berth with regard to immigration. I will also say that some of that case law harkens back to racist Supreme Court cases that said that the government has vast power over immigration because Chinese are known to be dirty and horrible, and so the government should have the power to leave these really horrible people out of the country. That said, I think not only do we have to be concerned, we still have to be concerned about government policy based on stereotype and fear, calling Muslims terrorists as a group, targeting Muslim majority countries. So I can't tell you exactly legally what's legal or not, but I think we have to have great concern about that policy.
Because I want to make sure we have time for questions, because we have some good ones coming in now. I want to ask, first of all, of all the panelists, you've all mentioned the need to do these things, to speak out, to not let these things happen again, that these things are happening again. But the most germane question may be, well, how do you do that? And that JAs have a certain moral responsibility because of our own history regarding this. Let me ask your thoughts on that. What's our moral obligation and what do we do specifically? Not just we need to do something.
I think I would expand on my last answer to say part of this is about not just what's legal, but it's, as you say, what's moral and what's right from a standpoint of human rights and human dignity. And separating children from their parents is not right from a standpoint of human dignity and morality. So I don't think again, as a lawyer, you'd think I'd just talk about what's legal or not. But I think in the end, what's legal or not isn't really necessarily the thing that's the key. It's really what's moral and right. And that's why all of us are the ones, as has been said before, who are responsible for making this country work. We can't leave it up to the politicians and the lawmakers. We've seen that before. And so I think morality has everything to do with it.
Jon, I know go ahead, Karen.
You pointed out specifically, Wendy, Japanese Americans in our community. And what we need to do is I guess culturally it's a little difficult for us sometimes, especially maybe the older generation, but to get outside of ourselves, to get outside of the community. Now, when I crisscross this country, I'm always promoting and encouraging to work across communities. I mean, the Japanese Americans certainly were the first ones to speak up after 9/11, but now more so, even the Chinese American community and the Black community, we all need to be purposeful and to find ways to work together with different groups. Now, it's been great, like I said, to see kind of the diversity of protest, to see people out there, at least trying to make people aware of all this hate and prejudice. And what's different was people don't realize that actually the civil rights movement of the 60s was the encouragement that gave Japanese Americans to fight redress and reparations. And so we need to continue that, but in a larger way. And, of course, we're going to, I guess, get to the point of voting and being civically engaged. But it sounds simple, but you have to make that effort. You can't wait for anyone else to do it. Each one of us has to commit to say, we are going to be part of the solution and not the problem.
Jon?
Well, we've talked around this, throughout this session, and I think it's just important to say that, the incarceration of our community was based on lies. It was based on politics, and it, ultimately, when it got to the courts, it was based upon a cover-up and a failure democracy. And I think it's important to put it in those terms, because as a community, we have experienced one of the greatest civil liberties violations in the history of this country. And I think it's important that we think about, what does that mean? What does that mean as far as our role in standing up and speaking out for other groups today? And it's kind of this odd thing, right? Because our community, and culturally, most of us were taught to not make waves, right? The nail that sticks out gets hit. That's like it's ingrained in all of us. It's even ingrained, even I feel it at times. And I think it's important that we are conscious of that, and we take intentional steps, like Karen said, to overcome that, and to think about how important in particular our voice is in this moment in history. I mean, we do have the moral authority to speak as a community that has been experienced mass incarceration. And I think we have to use that position to think about, how do we stand up and speak up for groups today? And I'm very encouraged by the activism that I see across this country right now, of people speaking out and standing in solidarity with each other, and seeing this movement to stand up for equity and justice. And I think we have to be a part of that. We have to embrace that and figure out our place in, now that, we are all comfortable in our homes and we aren't the target as much as before of the animosity of this country. We have to think about, how do we use our resources and our voices to stand up for others today? Because, again, we've talked about this before, but I think it's such an important lesson that in 1942, 99% of this country were either perpetrators and in support of the incarceration of our community, or they were bystanders. And I think that each of us today, moving forward, have to ask ourselves, which are we prepared to be? Are we going to be bystanders in what's taking place today? Or are we going to take, our position in society right now and try to do something about it?
Laura, you wanted to jump in?
So I was going to jump in with what Jon just said. I mean, that it's really a matter whether silence is complicity, and I think it is. It needs to be remembered that during World War II, very, very few people spoke up against the incarceration. None of the major civil rights organizations spoke up. A few brave souls did, but the country let it happen. And so I think silence is complicity, and as hard as it may be to find the space to be able to speak up, we know what happens if people don't speak up.
Yes, we very much do. I want to open it up to questions from people who are listening in. So if you go to YouTube, you can ask a question. And I have one here from Thomas Kurihara. What is your collective view that social media, or of social media, I should say, that allows individuals to express ingrained insecurity and has evolved to the environment of blame? So how is social media feeding all this, and what are your feelings about that? Okay.
You should go ahead.
I think it's obvious that it has. I mean, not how, but it has. And trying to this is kind of a phenomena that's been happening, not only across this country but around the world. So we all need to. I mean, I think go after people like Facebook and to make them accountable, to make these other organizations or these other companies to have some type of moral code, and to take a position where it's just not free reign. This is the whole idea behind respect. Where is the respect in social media? I mean, the bullying goes on. I got bullied when I was growing up in the playground and on the bus, but now it's in social media. And we all need to pay attention to that, but also to go after those companies that allow that to happen.
Going after the companies is one thing, because you can't, I mean, how do you force people to respect? That's a long process, right? That's a long process of education, which you're instituting.
We do. That's what we do.
So with regards to the immediate problem, I mean, education is long term, but immediate, what you're saying is one thing you could do to go after those companies. Jon, Karen, or Lori, any thoughts?
Well, I just think that and I think that all of us have to inform and educate ourselves. That we cannot rely on the positions that people take on social media as the truth. That we have to seek it out for ourselves. We have to educate ourselves. We have to find reliable and sources of information. And that is the world we live in. But I think we all each have to take personal responsibility for making sure that we seek out the truth. And I think that's part of one of the flaws in our country right now, is we're too willing to accept what somebody says versus seeking out the information ourselves.
Here's another question from Karen Sakata. How can we become more politically involved?
I'll come in with the social media question, which is really like we get on social media. We use social media to be able to connect people we know with information about forums like this, with articles, with information. I think that's one way to certainly use it. I think being involved in communicating with your elected officials, certainly about what your concerns are, being involved in electing public officials, supporting campaigns of people who you want their voice representing you, and even not necessarily people in your own district, but people nationally who will make a difference and you think will be highly effective. Talk to your friends, write letters to the editor about your views. So I think that there's a whole lot of ways to become politically involved. There's Asian American organizations that are politically involved. Certainly seek them out, support them, find out ways that we can join together to augment our voices. So I think that there are a number of different ways. And I think perhaps if you want to email one of us, maybe we could have some more specific suggestions.
Karen, I see your lips moving.
Yes, she's muted.
Oh, there you go. We didn't hear the beginning of that.
You're good.
Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, you need to take the initiative yourself. I mean, no one's going to do it for you. No one's going to be, knocking on your door. There's, people like the League of Women Voters. You can contact them, how you can help and how you can be involved, especially, for in polling places. But like Lori said, you can contact your own local office of elected officials. It doesn't have to be necessarily somebody in Congress, but you can do that as well. And find out ways that you can help, and also if you have complaints, or you want to register an issue, you people don't realize, and this is part about being civically engaged, or what we're trying to do is civically to educate about civics, is when you call an office of your local representative or state representative or member of Congress, they have to note that. Emails have to be noted so that their constituency can see what the position of their constituents are. So, don't think that that it's not going to count, because it does count. And as I think it was, I can't remember, Lori or John said, get your friends involved, get your community involved, get the organization that you're with involved. Work, like I said, across communities. Work with another organization, or there. And as Lori pointed out, and I'll just reinforce that, there are these organizations now that are Asian American political organizations that you can be part of, and call them up. Everyone's on the web these days. You're sitting at home, so do the research, and also learn about the issues. You have to also take the initiative to educate yourself about the issues in which you want to support.
Just adding on to that, Karen, and then John, I'm going to jump to you. And you're talking about working with Asian organizations, and many of them are right in your backyard. So you can make a bigger impact, I think, starting locally, and then let it work out from there as you join others in your own neighborhoods and in your own communities. John, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to give a shout out to groups like Student for Solidarity, Japanese American Citizens League. There's a lot of activism taking place across this country that you can get involved with right now. And I also just wanted to put in a plug that, myself, Karen, Lori, Don Tamaki, Dale Manami, before the pandemic, we were running around all over the country having this conversation, talking to communities about the need to be informed, to understand the parallels between the incarceration of Japanese Americans and what's taking place today, and the need for activism, the need for civic engagement. And so, and we haven't been just doing it on the coast. We've been going to red states and the interior of this country. And, I've seen parts of the country that I never thought I'd see, but I've seen them in the last few months, and it's been really important. And so I just wanted to encourage folks that if some of you feel like this conversation would be helpful to have in your communities, we're still, I'm not going to speak for these guys, but sharing one of the films like mine or others that are part of our that we've been sharing with groups to promote conversation, because I think that's such an important part of getting folks involved and engaged, is that we have to have dialogue and a conversation. And especially during a pandemic, it's so important, right, that we have forums to flesh out these issues and better understand how these things are being repeated, and what we need to do to make sure that we stop them.
We mentioned again that all three of the panelists you're listening to are very active with trying to stop repeating history, and that is the name of the organization they are working with, and the Fred Korematsu Institute. But I want to get into another question here, this one from Stan Shikuma. During the redress movement, we were able to mobilize the entire JA community. How do we mobilize that broadly again? Any one of you?
Well, I'll just say that I think an effort like redress is pretty daunting, right? I think it'd be a challenge to mobilize the entire community. Not saying that it can't be done, but one of the things that, I've been part of, I've been running a nonprofit in Japanese American community for over 20 years now. And one of the things I've been very adamant about is that one of the really important things that we have to be able to do is connect the organizations and groups within our own community and get them working together towards a common agenda. And that includes the religious institutions, the civic organizations, any place where our community gathers. We should be figuring out ways in which to connect ourselves, communicate with each other, and to try to get people moving together around a common issue. And, getting agreement in our community is not easy. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is a challenge, but I think it can be done. And, I certainly have been involved in that work and think that we can still make a lot of progress in that area.
So I guess what I would say is that I think there's extraordinary value in bringing the Japanese American community together. Conversations like this are really, really useful to help us figure out ways we can act and commonalities we have with regard to current day issues. I also think what's really, really critical, as has been discussed earlier, is really coalition work, and really, in some ways, finding out the communities that need our support, so that instead of necessarily focusing on organizing ourselves, it's really reaching out to organizations like Black Lives Matter and the people who are really at the forefront of many of the current day conversations, and reach out and see what are ways that we can support you and what are ways we can ally with you. And thank you so much, Jon, for stating we are all here to be able, whatever we can do to support your communities, to support local communities nationwide, to help draw these connections and share ways in which we can support local communities. We'd love to do that. One thing I said, and I have to say, is the question earlier about how can we become politically engaged, run for office. Please.
Oh, is this an announcement, Laurie?
Yeah, right. We need our Asian American leaders, and actually not just Asian American leaders, but leaders who won't do the things that they did during World War II, who will be responsible, who will uphold the rule of law. We need them. You're needed. So please consider that.
Here's a good question from Scott Hallmark. Do you feel the history that is currently taught accurately deals with the JA internment during World War II? Do you think a lack of, Jon's answer right there on his face, do you think a lack of cultural honesty contributes to how to the fact that America has not evolved much on this topic?
Well, I'll take the education part, because that's what the Korematsu Institute does. We started off with just K through 12 education and curriculum. I mean, now it's expanded to, K through 16 and now public. But, I'll put in the plug for, parents now, especially because this was curriculum for teachers. And I work with the National Council for Social Studies Teachers, which is the largest social studies organization in the United States. And I've been speaking to their conferences, every year, and working with the curriculum, also with the different departments of educations of each state. So I belong to a group called CS4, where we're trying to do that. It's slow because, you have to understand that each state has its own criteria and standards for their education. There's not one blank kind of policy. And so that's been, that's why I started this with 2009, 2010, to make sure that, the information was to teachers, because obviously it hasn't been in the textbooks. Now we still have a long ways to go, and we do this work through grants, and we're trying to evolve our curriculum. But now parents can go to the Korematsu Institute.org website and to fill out the form and access our materials online. so that because we realized that we had many requests just right after the lockdown. And so we're still making that accessible. We have a long ways to go, but that's where you want to support also, go back to elected officials, your boards of education. Pay attention to your board of education, who's on the board, what kind of curriculum are they supporting? And also, like now I'm working with Superintendent Tony Thurmond for the state of California. These are the kinds of people that we need to support as elected officials, and so that we can make sure that our agenda is put forward.
And a perfect time to do this right now is Black Lives Matter has brought up this whole question of how we teach American history and how we all fit into that larger fabric. Maybe someday we won't have to have Asian American History Month and Black History Month. Maybe our histories will actually be told in the entire, in the history of all of America.
And that's why, Wendy, that ethnic studies is so important to support, because in ethnic studies we get a larger cross section, and that's what we've been trying to have supported in schools now.
Oh yeah, no, I totally get that. What I'm saying is that maybe someday it won't be ethnic American studies; it'll be American studies, and all of us.
I thought we were going to be learning this.
We are America. We are America, and this story is American, a distinctly American story. John, you had a thought.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's important that we all recognize the fact. So I've been traveling to schools and communities and film festivals all over the country, and there are massive swaths of our population who don't even know the incarceration happened, to respond to that question. And that's how far we have fallen as a country in understanding our history. We are not a country that likes to admit our mistakes, especially today, let alone a massive scandal, which is what the incarceration of Japanese Americans really was. And so, not to plug my film again, but, most of what's in my film, almost nobody, even in our own community, most people do not know all the facts behind the incarceration of Japanese Americans. So we still have a tremendous amount of work to do in this area. I just want to encourage everybody to find ways to, encourage this education, to connect it to what's going on today, to find ways to keep this history alive. And as Karen said, I think really systemic advocacy in our educational institutions is so critical. There's one school district in Southern California, the ABC school district, who had a day of remembrance for the entire school district. So every student during that period learned about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And that's, frankly, it's not done in the vast majority of our country. And so it's something we have to be vigilant about. And we all have to be educators moving into the future.
I think we do. One quick personal thing, and then I think it's our time to wrap up. But we're talking about how to make those changes happen and how to do it on social media. And a lot of it, not just social media, but just conversation with people we know. How many conversations have you had? Haven't you all had conversations since Black Lives Matter movement started about why you feel strongly about this and why this reverberates? I know that friends of mine who are not Japanese American, I've described how I felt growing up, really on the outside, very much a second-class citizen. We grew up in the shadow of the internment and carried all of our parents' fears and their feelings about having their entire lives thrown apart because of who we were. And those feelings continue for generations. They don't go away because they take down the barbed wire fence. So just these personal conversations with friends or on social media about how we really feel. When you hear people talk about Muslims and the way they do it, you hear about these children being held in barbed wire or in fences, in cages along the border, that it reverberates within Japanese Americans in a very distinctive way. I feel that, and I see that, I feel it in all of us that I've talked to. I want to thank all of the panelists for doing this today. What a wonderful project, this Tadaima, these ritual pilgrimages, and maybe someday we'll get to go back to our real life pilgrimages. But thanks all of you who are out there in your front rooms listening to this, and thanks again to our panelists, not just for being here today, but for the good work you do. Okay.
And thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you everyone who came.
Thank you.
Karen and John.
Thank you. Thank you
Sign
too.
off now.
Okay, thanks, Carmen.